JSP 3rd Gen Prelude, episode number 6. In this episode, we pull the engine out of the car so that we can get the engine bay ready for paint. There's also some other prep work and repair work that's needed as well. My son Levin has helped me with a bunch of projects in the shop, but this will be his first time pulling an engine, so I wanted him to see exactly how it's done. We've already disconnected just about everything off the engine while we were doing all the fab work, but we still need to do some of the stuff underneath, like pull the axles. We're going to start by just draining the oil from the transmission and the engine. The drain bolt on the transmission is actually just a 3/8 square drive that you can stick a ratchet into to loosen. It's pretty handy. The transmission only takes about 2 quarts of oil, so there's not much to come out here. Next, we remove the engine oil drain bolt, which is just a 17mm head. You can just use a wrench or a socket, it comes off pretty easily. I'm going to let Levin do this one. After you spill the oil all over the place, just go get a couple of rags and start cleaning it up. After you're done draining and cleaning, you can put the drain bolt back in. After all the fluids are removed, then you can start removing the axles. I usually start with just the axle nuts on the ends. This is usually a 32 or 36mm on Hondas. The reason I do the nut first is because sometimes these are really tight and difficult to remove. And if you take all the other suspension components apart first, and then you go try to remove the axle nut and it's too tight to remove, you're going to have to reassemble a lot of the suspension so that you can have somebody sit in the car and hold the brakes while you loosen the nut with a breaker bar. Most Hondas of this era have very similar front suspension. It's just a typical double wishbone suspension design here, with a shock and a fork that attaches to the lower control arm. So to get the axle out, we just have to remove the hub from the lower control arm and then remove the fork that wraps around the axle. With the suspension apart, then you can just pop the axle out of the transmission. It just takes a pry bar. There's only a little C-clip on the inside of the axle retaining it into the differential, so it doesn't take much force. After it pops out a little bit, it just slides out the rest of the way. The axle removal for both sides is the same. The only difference on the driver's side is that instead of popping the axle out of the transmission, you're just removing it from the intermediate or half shaft. After removing the axles, it's good practice to put the suspension back together just so that if you need to, you can roll the car around and you don't lose any of the hardware. Like I said before, we pretty much had everything off this engine while we were doing the fabrication, so just the only thing that's left is removing the 3 engine mounts. I'm going to start by removing the rear T-bracket, then the driver's side mount, hooking up the chain, and then taking off the transmission mount and lifting the engine out. I've probably pulled about 500,000 B-Series engines out of Honda Civics, but this is my first time trying to pull an H out of a Prelude, so I wasn't quite sure what to expect. When hooking the chain to a front-wheel drive engine like this, it's important to get the engine balanced correctly. You don't want the engine leaning too far one way or the other, and you also don't want the chain to be on the front half or back half only. You want it split between the front and the back of the engine so that when it lifts it out evenly without rocking or twisting. With the innovative mount removed from the transmission, then it's time to just remove the engine mounting bracket off the frame rail, just to give us a little bit of extra clearance. With all of the engine mounts unbolted, now it was time to try lifting the engine out of the car. It became quickly apparent that this engine is much larger than what the car was actually designed for, and we were going to try twisting and rotating the engine a bit to see if we could get it to come out, but it seemed like the transmission side was catching on the underside of the frame rail. After rotating the engine a little bit, then we were hitting on the driver's side with the crank pulley and the air conditioning compressor. Me being a little bit stubborn and not wanting to remove the alternator and AC compressor, I decided to lower the engine back down and I reset the chain to try to pick the engine up at a bit of an angle, thinking that it would be easier to get the engine out. I put a jack underneath the transmission so that I could take the weight off of the chain. That way I could reset the chain on the transmission side, making it longer so that the chain on the engine side was shorter, so that when we started lifting the engine, it would pick up the engine side first. Hopefully this was so that I could angle the engine and pull it out without removing all that other stuff. Our second attempt of pulling the engine out wasn't much different than the first. It was a little bit better, and we tried to rotate the engine again to try to pull it out, but in the end, I just had to remove the alternator and AC compressor. You can see just how easily the engine moves around with those two things unbolted. It came out no problem after pulling them off. While the engine's out of the car, we're going to do a little bit of a refresh on it. I'm going to pull the head off and send it out to get freshened up. We're also going to remove this transmission because I found out it's an Accord transmission and not a Prelude transmission. So I've actually picked up a 5th gen Prelude transmission to go on this engine instead. One interesting thing that I noticed while pulling the engine apart is that the axle nuts were different sizes. The passenger axle nut was a 36mm and the driver's side axle nut was a 32mm. This is an indicator that the spline on the hubs themselves is actually different. So I'm going to have to figure out why there's a 32mm axle nut spline on the driver's side and a 36mm axle nut spline on the passenger side. Here you can see the two axles next to each other and see that the axle on the right is quite a bit larger than the axle on the left on the spline itself. We can also see that the passenger side axle has an ABS ring on it, indicating that it's off of a newer vehicle. So we're going to have to do some investigating to see why these axles are different and what axles I'm going to need to get to replace them. With the engine removed, now we can view the engine bay and see all the things that are going to be needed before paint. There's going to be a lot of parts that get removed. There's some repair work that needs to be done, which I'll show you. And overall, just a lot of cleaning and preparation. My goal for this engine bay is just a nice clean setup that has all of the unnecessary things removed. I'm going to relocate the fuse box to tidy it up a bit. The battery will be relocated as well. I'm going to go through and remove all the little brackets and tabs that aren't going to be used, but I am going to keep some of the stuff that'll make the car nice to drive around, like the air conditioning. So this is at a point where I'm going to go through and start disassembling, figuring out what I need and what I don't need. The first thing we're going to do is just start by removing all the body panels. That includes the bumper, the fenders, and the headlights so that we can get underneath the core support, remove the air conditioning condenser, the power steering cooler, and all of the other stuff that's hidden away. Since this car has the Japanese fixed headlight front end, it's a bit of a conversion that had to be done, including changing the front upper core support. So getting this thing apart was actually a good idea just so that I can assess how the conversion was done and see if there was anything that I wanted to repair or improve before painting the engine bay. There's no real surprises when taking apart the front end of a Honda. They assemble pretty easily and they disassemble pretty easily. No hidden bolts, no unusual tools, everything comes apart really simply. Anytime I disassemble a car I'm not extremely familiar with, I'm going to go ahead and take a bunch of detailed pictures of where everything was routed and how everything was put together so that when I put the car back together after painting it, I've got something to reference. It's really common to disassemble stuff, throw all the bolts in a bin and all the pieces into a bin, and not really remember how it went before. With all the body panels removed, now it's easy to take out everything that's going to be in the way when we're painting the engine bay. So Levin's taking all of the air conditioning and power steering stuff off the front end, and I'm just removing all the accessories off the firewall. Once we get everything torn apart, then you can finally start to see some of the damage that I was talking about. It looks like the front of this car was bumped a little bit, as well as the passenger strut tower. But let's take a look at the front first. You can see that the lower radiator support is pushed in on the passenger side. If you reference it to the traction bar, you can see that this passenger side is closer than the driver's side is. So we're going to have to try to pull the front of this core support out a little bit. Looking at it from the side, it's very obvious, as you can see that the sheet metal here is angled inward. It actually has a kink in it. If you compare it to the other side is perfectly straight. It doesn't look like this was something that happened as part of a major collision, but maybe the car went up over a curb or something like that. Shouldn't be very hard to pull it out. We've got just about all the stuff on the front end removed here. Just a couple of things left on the firewall to do, like the brake booster, the brake master cylinder, the clutch master cylinder, those types of things before we paint it. But I'm going to address the core support first. Luckily, all the sheet metal on the driver's side headlight is actually really straight, and so it'll be easy to reference this when I'm straightening out the passenger side. This headlight mount looks like it had some damage done to it as well. Over here on this side, there's a kink and a crease, and on the inner side and along the front, I've already straightened some of this a bit, but it was all smashed in quite a bit. There was a little bit of body work done around the edges, some cracking in the corners. I'm going to have to do some sheet metal work to straighten this out. After a couple of hours of work with a hammer and dolly, I'm pretty happy with the repair work on the top of this headlight mount. It's going to require a little bit of filler just to smooth it out before painting, but now the headlight actually fits a lot better than it did before. I was able to pull the lower radiator support forward with some tie straps. I was also able to straighten the headlight bucket area, the sheet metal right here, by attaching a slide hammer to where the bumper support mounts underneath the headlight. There was a couple of solid mounting points that were clearly the areas that were pushed in. So after using a slide hammer on those, pulling them out, I was able to straighten out the sheet metal. The traction bracket is removed, but you can just use a visual reference off the top core support to see that it's much straighter than it was before. The last bit of sheet metal repair work that's going to be needed on this car is on the passenger strut tower. It looks like this side of the car was bumped at 1.2 and the upper control arm hit the underside of the mount here and it cracked it. So somebody's done a pretty poor repair job on this and just covered it with a bunch of goop. There's also a little pinhole in the front here. I'm not sure how that happened. But we're going to have to grind all this off, repair it, weld it correctly, smooth it all out, and then we can finally get to the point where we can start sanding and getting the car ready to paint. But that will be the next episode. Thanks for watching. Please comment below with any questions or things that you'd like to see.